Welcome all of you to the first lecture of our course on the making of the Chinese Buddhist canon. It's a topic which I have been working with for many years, and it's one that I find great interest in. So I'm happy to have this opportunity to once again revisit some of the issues, think about them anew, and share them with all of you. The Chinese Buddhist canon was created basically from Indic texts coming through first Central Asia and later coming by sea to China. It was an enormous task to translate those Indic texts into Chinese. So for this lecture, we're going to look at just what was involved and how the first transmission took place through Central Asia. The spread of Buddhism out of India first did take place by land, in the sense that getting to China, the first Buddhists that we record took the Inner Asia trade routes. As you can see from this, the way for them to get out of India and into China was blocked by two things. One, the Himalayan mountains, the highest mountains on earth, and also the rivers which drain those mountains created really very formidable blockages in terms of travel. So the best way to do it was to go all the way up to the Karakoram range that you see here, and to go around the Himalayas, go through it's called the Taklamakan Desert, sometimes Taklamakan Basin, as you see there, which had two routes. You could either go the southern route or the northern route. They joined up at Anshi, as you can see, and from there leading down to Chang'an, present-day Xi'an, the capital of the Han Dynasty. It was an enormous trip. And when we think about how people traveled and what travel involved in those days, we have to consider that not many people ever traveled. Travel was a big thing. If you traveled, think of what had to happen. If you went away from home overnight, you had to have some place to sleep, you had to have food, you had to have shelter. And if you had a long trip, you had to know the route, you had to know how to get there. And if it was many days' journey, then you either had to carry enough money or something to exchange for food and shelter. So people didn't make long journeys. Those who did got made into historic figures of renown. You were a hero if you made a long journey, because it was a difficult thing. So we're looking at how did the Buddhist make their way and take their text from India and get them into China. It was not only a geological or a geographic journey, it was a cultural journey. India and China have been two of the great cultural empires of the world, if you will. And as you see, they lay next to each other, but with this great big barrier between them. And so as a result, there was not a lot of travel between them. It was too difficult, and those who traveled had to have help. So in one way, the Buddhist texts, the first ones probably did not get picked up by somebody in the Ganges Basin and physically taken from there to Chang'an. We think that what happened is that the texts first had an interim journey. They went into Central Asia, and when they went into Central Asia, they came in contact with cultural issues. Once you began to move out of India into Central Asia, you ran into empires. And empires were a way in which the Eurasia landmass was ruled often. The Parthian Empire was one that played an enormously important role for the spread of the Buddhist texts. Parthia, as you can see, was an empire that stretched almost from the Mediterranean world into Inner Asia and India. It covered all of Persia. The Parthians were enemies of the Roman Empire. They fought the Romans, and the Romans felt that they cheated because the Parthians had developed a way of fighting which was to turn their horses in a battle and appear to be retreating. But as they retreated, suddenly they would turn in the saddle and shoot backwards. And the enemy was unprepared for this move. They thought they had them on the run. And instead of having them on the run, they were met with a shower of arrows. It was the Parthian shot. Now, some of you may recognize this in an expression which we use, expression that we use when somebody stops at the door as they leave, turn around and say something really cutting or upsetting, and then go on their way. We call that the parting shot, but it was really actually a Parthian shot because the Parthians developed this. The first person to make it to China with Buddhist texts in hand and set up a translation bureau was an Eastern Parthian prince, we're told. The Parthians were this huge empire, as you can see. And from one end to the other was very hard to anybody to control it. The Eastern Parthians, in effect, had their own culture. And many of them became Buddhist. And it was the Buddhism of the Eastern Parthians that helped to carry the text on into China. The Parthian Empire lay over an area which has been under constant battles, constant empires coming and going. Alexander the Great had conquered it. And when Alexander the Great conquered it and turned to go home, he left behind troops. Greeks were left there. And they formed an empire of their own, the Greco-Bactrian Empire or kingdom. And they were very Greek. They got the Greek culture. They made the open air theaters like the Greeks. Their statues and their artwork was Greek. And their cultural patterns really helped to develop some aspects of Buddhism. We think perhaps that the Bactrians were the ones who introduced the Buddhist to the idea of making a portrait image of the Buddha. That is, an image which was a recognizable face, a portrait, even though we know that they didn't have the Buddha in front of them when they made these images, but they were made like portraits. So the Greco-Bactrian kingdom was also there when the people came from the Parthians. And Buddhism, as it passes through this, we're still not sure exactly what happened. They may have translated the Sanskrit text into Sogdian. As you can see, Sogdiana up there. Sogdian was a language. They may have, in translating it into a local language, have been really the forerunners before the Chinese. And when the Parthians and later the Kushan people from Central Asia carried texts into China, they may not all have been in Sanskrit. They may have been in Sogdian, for example, just an example. So the journey of the Buddhist text is not only over a long distance, it's also through layers of cultural information that had been accumulating over the years as one empire after another took over the region that it passed through. How did even someone like the Parthians, how did they travel to China? And the only way that you could do it was to find people, number one, knew the way, knew how to get over the passes, these high mountain passes, how to cross the rivers. And the only people who could have known that were merchants. Nobody else was traveling except for soldiers who came in and invaded, like the Greeks. The Parthians were invaders in a sense as well. But the real force that Buddhism relied on was not armies. They relied on merchants. Now, merchants didn't just pick up and walk from India to China. was a rare person who made that whole journey. They did relay. So each merchant might have a circuit. They would go between two towns, or they might go to several towns before they turned and came back. But they repeated their trips over and over. And some of them had multiple homes. Sometimes they had multiple families. And they were unlike other people. The Buddhists welcomed them, and they welcomed Buddhism. The traditional Vedic tradition of India did not like merchants because they were considered to be a low caste group. They were not Brahmanic priests. They traveled among strangers, which was polluting to the ritually pure Brahmanic tradition. And therefore, they were often looked down upon, even rejected, but not by the Buddhists. The Buddha himself was a traveler. He traveled all through the Gangetic Basin, may have at the longest made journeys of up to 100 miles. So he was unusual, but he was like a cultural merchant, if you will. So the Buddhist texts had to, number one, find a way to get into the cultural groups that were in Central Asia, or they had to find a way to be carried by the merchants through these relays. And people, the monks from India and Central Asia would go with the merchants as through their circuit, and they would then be dropped off. They would pick up a merchant who was going to do the next segment until they were dropped off again, and another. So the process was very complicated, and it's still a story that we're learning to tell. As you go along through Central Asia and you travel the so-called Silk Road, it is so remarkable because you still see the ruins of the small towns which constituted those areas where the merchants visited. In other words, these mercantile groups, as they moved through these regions, were establishing cities. The cities were, of course, some of them quite nice, because as you can see from even the ruins, sizable structures. The structuring you see here is from rammed earth. They didn't have trees, they didn't have enough wood out in that region because it was desert. So you take earth and you pound it. And if you pound it long enough, it becomes like concrete. And people are still building houses from rammed earth, even in the United States. People build rammed earth houses. And even when it rains, it doesn't wash them away because they're like concrete when they're built. And these are the ruins of those cities. We know that through these cities, past the merchants, with the monks who carried with them Buddhist texts. And now it's all ruins. So how did this come about? The first explanation is often given, well, they ran out of water. It's desert. But I, as some of you know, have put forward the position that I believe that the trade between India and China switched from these routes and became sea. People went by sea. The ability to carry huge loads of cargo in a ship compared to how much you could carry on the back of a camel, in a sense, replaced this whole system, which was functioning when the Buddhist texts were being carried from India to China. As you go along that route, and I did it some years ago, and it was a fascinating trip. I loved it. I felt that I could see exactly how it operated. Like the famous Bezeklik caves, beautiful caves. They have been influenced by the Bactrians, so it's Greco-Roman art in some of them, not just Indian, but Greco-Roman. And as you can see from the green trees in this desert region, it was a place where there was a stream, there was water. It was a springhead. That is where the water table comes to the surface. And water, which is quite ancient sometimes, will be coming out of the ground where the water table has surfaced. And of course, once people find out where this is, the trade routes based their stop on where there was water. And the Bezeklik caves, this must have been a very prosperous place because they built such magnificent caves, and the merchants who flowed by would come and give their support. And they supported the Buddhist monks because the Buddhist monks accepted them. They were always seen, I think, as good luck to have a monk with you on your journey. I say monk because we have no record of women making the journey. It was maybe too dangerous for a woman to travel. The first nuns who went to China, the first Indian nuns, did it by sea. And it wasn't until the 5th century that they made it there and began to ordain Chinese women. It didn't happen through these mercantile routes like Bezeklik and other ruined cities. For archaeologists in the future, it's wonderful. A lot of these cities have never been archaeologically explored. We have no idea what can be discovered when you really start to uncover what was in those places. They didn't have a very high culture, if you will, because it was so isolated. Each place was small. They were dependent on itinerant merchants to keep them going. But it worked, and the Buddhists made use of it. When the trade routes entered China, I told you that at the Taklamakan Desert, you could take either the southern or the northern route. southern and the northern routes came together at a famous place called Dunhuang. And there at Dunhuang, the merchants helped to dig and prepare hundreds of caves. And some of these would probably have been family projects. Inside the caves, they did all of they painted them, they made images, they were used obviously for ritual purposes. And it's become one of the major tourist sites for China when people can travel. That's one of the wonderful places to go. So when you get to Dunhuang, then it's like all the merchants heading from Central Asia and India toward China converge at this place. And from there, the journey into China proper, while difficult, was not as difficult as the area before Dunhuang. Taklamakan Basin is one of the driest places on earth and one of the hottest. There's an estimate that in some places, rain has not hit the ground for maybe 800 years. It evaporates before it gets to the ground. We're finding that in California. We have these huge fires. And one of the great problems is when a fire gets too hot, you can spray water on it, but the water doesn't get to the fire because the water evaporates in the heat before it can get to the source of the fire. So the extreme heat and problem of getting across the Taklamakan Desert was something. One of the travelers said, what you do is you just follow the bones of the dead animals that have died from thirst, probably carrying the loads of stuff across the desert. So Buddhism now has come into the Chinese sphere. This is where, in a sense, the major contact with China was beginning to take place, was here in Dunhuang. And so when you see over the years the caves, how they were decorated, you can see that they have the influence from India, the influence from Central Asia, but they also have the influence from China itself. And so the Buddhist texts that are creeping along, when they reach Dunhuang, they're getting closer to the capital at Chang'an. Now at Dunhuang, for the Buddhist canon, we were very lucky. In the early part of the 20th century, a cave was discovered at Dunhuang, which had been sealed. And nobody for centuries knew it was there. There was an old Taoist monk who lived there, and he tried to keep the caves up because the travel had ceased in many ways, and the caves were not kept in good order, but the old Taoist monk tried his best. He smoked the tobacco, which he grew, and he stuck the straw that he used to light his pipe in a little crack where he sat on the step. And finally, he realized, I've been sitting here smoking for years and stuffing in this crack, and it never gets full. Why is that? And so he began to look at the wall, and he realized, my gosh, this place has a door, and it's been sealed. He could begin to see the vague outline of the door. And so he opened it up, and inside were thousands of scrolls, mainly Buddhist, but also of other materials. He began to sell them. Sir Aurel Stein came from England and took thousands away. Pelliot, who's pictured here in the slide, came from Paris. Stein, who came and took the first of these, didn't read Chinese. He was an explorer, but he didn't read Chinese. So he selected manuscripts on the basis of what they looked like. So he chose the ones that seemed in good shape. Pelliot was one of the top sinologists of Europe, and his Chinese was superb. So he started reading the texts, actually reading them before he decided to buy them. And what he looked for were texts that he had never heard of. He wasn't too interested in another copy of the Heart Sutra or another copy of the Diamond Sutra. He tossed those back away. He was looking for things that he had not heard of before. And so he put together a collection of very valuable scrolls, which still reside in Paris. So we know from looking at this that at Dunhuang, there was a major Buddhist site for manuscripts. Why they were put here, nobody is really sure. They date to about 1000, the year 1000. None of them seem to have a date after that. So it's quite possible that they were sealed for almost 1,000 years in this very dry climate. So they were preserved very well. People have said they were put in there because they were being protected from invaders. But I think that there must be other reasons, because they are, it's obvious that they had a copy center here. It's obvious that there was a monastery where monks studied texts. But for some reason, these texts were no longer being used, obviously. And so to not destroy sacred texts, they were considered sacred objects. They were simply moved and put into this cave and sealed for whatever reason. We'll keep listening as scholars try to figure it out. So a lot of what we know about the Buddhist texts that were being produced before 1000 depends on what we find here at these thousands of textual materials at the Dunhuang cave. It was cave number 17. So finally, the manuscripts began to reach Chang'an, the capital of the Han Dynasty. And then the question was, what do you do once you've reached this kind of terminus of the travel route. While you could keep on going to the sea and to the northern areas, Beijing was not yet a capital. Nanjing and Hangzhou were important places. Luoyang was also an important place, but this is where the first translation was set up at Chang'an. And it was made by a Parthian. So Ansher Gao, who came here, had this terrific idea of, let's translate our texts, our Buddhist texts, into Chinese. What a thought, and how difficult. Sanskrit has an alphabet. It has scripts, as you can see in the top. It takes several aksharas, several letters in a Sanskrit manuscript to put together a word, just as it is in English. How do you render it in Chinese? There is no equivalent sometimes for the Sanskrit word. It's like for us with English, there are many words that we have no equivalent for. We don't really have a word for karma. We don't have a word for nirvana. We don't have a word for the Buddha even. We don't have a word for prajna, wisdom even in some ways. So what do you do if you have all these new words coming at you, which are very important in the tradition that you're beginning to study, and yet you've got no equivalents? You borrow them. You take their word and you add it to your language. That's what we've done. We've made nirvana an English word. You can see it in ads. You can see it listed in novels. You can see it used. It's a perfectly good English word now. The Chinese did the same. They represented the sound of the word with the characters. And so this process of translating from an Indo-European language like Sanskrit, which had an elaborate grammatic structure of cases, tense, numbers. You could make a plural out of a word. You could make a dual. You could make a singular form of it. Chinese had none of that. So the process of translating from Indo-European into the Chinese character glyphs was a huge task. And we still have examples of what they did and how they tried to translate. And you can read it and you can make sense out of it. They did a wonderful job. It's a miracle almost that it happened. So we take the word prajna. The two Chinese characters that they use are not for meaning. They don't tell you what it means. They tell you what it sounds like. The first one is pa, pan, na, old pronunciations for these characters. Well, we know that in India, prajna was the Sanskrit, classical Sanskrit pronunciation, but there were many what were called, we could say were local dialects, where the pronunciation, they were called Prakrits, those local pronunciations were quite different. So in the Pali Canon of Buddhism, we have the word panna for it. They don't say prajna, they say panna. So when we look at the Chinese, we see panna. That tells us that the Chinese were receiving texts which were not altogether written in classical Sanskrit, but they were written in vernaculars, in what were called Prakrits. So that in one sense, when you're trying to work with a transliteration, that's what we call this, a transliteration, where you use a Chinese character for its sound, you still got a lot of work to do. You have to figure out, how was that character pronounced 1,500 years ago? And in India, how was the word for wisdom pronounced 2,000 years ago? In both cases, you have to reconstruct the phonology, the sounds, the ancient sounds. And it shows us that the Chinese had to develop a form of just bringing to the forefront the sounds, because they had no equivalent characters. When you come to look at the texts that were being translated, I'll recommend that you learn how to use a catalog that I made many years ago for the Korean Buddhist canon in Chinese. And we have Mueller at the University of Tokyo, who digitized this catalog, and it's now on the net. You can open up and use it for free. When the University of Tokyo asked me, could they digitize my catalog? I said, yes, with one proviso, has to be free. Can't charge anybody for it. So you can go in and use it. So anytime you have a Buddhist Chinese text, or even if you are trying to find out about a Sanskrit text, here is a tool which you can use. If you look at this, you can see that it says K2. That's Korean. The 2 says this is the second text in terms of the sequence of how the texts are arranged. I created the K numbering system and made it the international numbering for the Korean canon. But most of the time, people don't use the Korean because it wasn't easily available to them. They use the Taisho edition of Japan. So if you look further along the line, you'll see T221. That's the Taisho sequential number, which is different than the K number. But you can understand the witnesses that we talked about. So the Panchavimshati Shatasahasrika Prajna Paramita Sutra, which is the perfection of wisdom in 25,000 lines, is what it means, is numbered in Roman numeral 2 in Tibetan. It's in Roman numeral 1, Sanskrit, Roman numerals 3, Chinese, Chinese characters, Korean equivalents. And we know that this K2 was translated by Mokshala. The 10th day, the 5th month, the 1st year in the Western Jin dynasty, which would work out to be that we know from that far back, we know this text was finished July 23rd, 291. It's remarkable that the Chinese have given us this record. Not only were their translations being made against many odds, but the translations were also being preserved in libraries with very careful information in the colophon about who did it, who did the translation, and when they did it. So if you go to the second column, you'll see that you have K1 with 2 in a parens, K3, K4, and K549. This says that in the Chinese canon, this text has been translated several times. It wasn't just once. So you can go look at each of those numbers and see that over the centuries, these Buddhist texts were being retranslated. The printing blocks that the Koreans made were carved in 1238. And we get below that other catalogs, Nanjo's catalog, Ono's catalog, the Mahavyupati, the Otani catalog. These are all other catalogs for Tibetan, Sanskrit, Chinese. Under number 5, if we have an existing Sanskrit manuscript that still exists, where is it? Has it been published? Under 6, the Tibetan main 5 block print editions in the Tibetan, P for Peking, the first one ever made, and that is Tibetan being made into a print, Nartang Derge Lhasa Chone. So I have created this catalog and I've made it available to you. And there's the HTTP address up above. So I recommend that if you're going to be studying the canon, you at least learn how to use this as one way to get yourself into it. Even if you don't know Chinese, you can find a lot of information. So An Zhigao was the first great translator. We see that there are many ways his name can be used. It can be S-H-I-G, or it can be S-H-I-H-K, the Wade Giles system, the Pinyin system. The Japanese have their own way, Ansego. The Japanese and the Vietnamese have different ways of pronouncing the name of this one person. So sometimes as you're working, you have to realize that the names of people took many different forms depending on how the characters were pronounced. Lokakshema was the other person. Lokakshema was the first one to translate a major Mahayana text, which was the Prajnaparamita in 8,000 lines. And that was done at 147. So we'll pause here for this particular lecture. I know that you've been sitting for quite a while watching. You can see, though, that we have ways to understand how the text came to China. And once they got there, we can see what was done with them when they were translated. And that we have scholarly tools which help us to understand and to deal with the texts that were being translated and produced in China itself. So next time, we'll be talking about what I've called the second wave of translation. And it's going to be looking at what happens after you have a certain number of translations available to people and they know something about it, about Buddhism. How did they translate compared to these first people who were the real pioneers? And we owe them such a debt. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.